The wind scraped across the desert, lifting grains of sand that stung the skin like tiny blades. The horizon stretched endlessly, a fading line between the dying light and the cold blue of the oncoming night. In that lonely expanse, two figures moved, one crawling, the other standing still, watching with a calm that held both danger and sorrow. The man's long hair whipped in the dry wind, his chest bare and scarred, his eyes dark as the earth itself. The woman in front of him struggled to breathe, her torn blue dress clinging to her dust-covered skin, her hands trembling as she tried to rise. Each movement was heavy, desperate. She had run until her strength gave out, but he had followed her without sound, as if the desert itself had carried him forward. She turned slowly, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The setting sun caught the copper tones in his skin, the muscles beneath his stillness. Her lips cracked when she spoke, voice hoarse from thirst and fear. "Don't kill me," she whispered. The words broke the silence like a small stone dropped into still water. "I'll give you strong children." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe the last thread of hope, but her words hung between them, trembling in the dry air. The Apache warrior didn't move. His breathing was steady, his face unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed frozen. The wind died down, the sky turned molten red, and the only sound was her shallow gasps. Then slowly, he crouched beside her. His shadow fell across her, long and dark. But instead of reaching for his knife, he did something unexpected. He placed his hand on the ground beside her, palm open, letting the sand slip through his fingers. His gaze stayed on her face, not with cruelty, but with something ancient, something heavy. She didn't understand it, not yet. The same man who had struck down the soldiers that burned his village now looked at her like a question he couldn't answer. His people had been hunted, their lands stolen, their spirits crushed beneath boots that called themselves civilized. Yet here he was, staring at the trembling woman who wore the scent of those same men, and something in him refused the cycle of blood. She looked at him, confusion mixing with fear. The tales she had heard painted the Apache as shadows of the mountains, merciless, silent, wild, but the man before her was not wild. His eyes carried a calm that unsettled her more than rage ever could. It was the calm of someone who had seen too much death, too much betrayal, and still chose not to let hate devour what was left of his soul. The sky darkened. Coyotes began to cry from far away, their voices echoing like ghosts across the barren land. He rose, glancing toward the horizon where the sun had died. Then, without a word, he extended his hand toward her. She stared at it, uncertain. Her heart pounded, her mind screamed to run, but her body was too weak, and something in his silence held her still. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet, his grip firm but not cruel. Her knees buckled, and he steadied her. For the first time she noticed the marks on his wrists, the faint scars that told of captivity. She realized then that they were both prisoners in different ways. She caught between fear and guilt. He between vengeance and mercy. The desert wind rose again, circling them like a whisper from the old world. They began to walk, not as captor and captive, but as two souls who didn't yet understand what bound them together. The land stretched endless before them, silent witnesses 2 centuries of suffering and survival. The Apache led the way, his steps sure and measured. She followed, glancing at the knife strapped to his side, wondering when he might use it. But he didn't. Each mile they crossed deepened the mystery. Sometimes he glanced back, not with anger, but as if to make sure she was still there. By the time the moon rose, their shadows stretched across the sand like stories waiting to be told. They stopped near a cluster of rocks, where he gathered dry branches and struck flint until a small flame was born. The firelight painted his face in flickering gold and crimson. She sat across from him, the warmth brushing her skin, the tension still coiled tight inside her. He reached into a leather pouch and tossed a strip of dried meat her way. She hesitated, then took it. Hunger was stronger than pride. Neither spoke for a long time. The night hummed with insects and the distant cry of an owl. When she finally found her voice, it came soft and uncertain. "Why didn't you kill me?" He didn't answer at first. He poked at the fire, watching sparks rise like memories into the dark. Then he said quietly, "Enough blood has fed this land." His voice carried an accent shaped by old languages, a rhythm that made her chest ache. The earth remembers every drop. She didn't understand his full meaning, but the weight of his words stayed with her. There was something different about him, not the savage she had been told to fear, but a man who carried both fury and restraint, shaped by loss, yet guided by something deeper. She studied his face in the glow of the fire, and for the first time, she saw more than a warrior. She saw someone haunted by choices, by ghosts that followed even when the battle was over. As the night deepened, her mind wandered to the moment he found her. She had been running from the outpost, from men who had promised safety and delivered cruelty. Desert had swallowed her until her strength broke. She remembered falling, tasting the dust, and when she looked up, he was there standing over her like an answer she didn't ask for. She thought he would end her, but instead he had carried her water, shielded her from the sun, and said nothing. That silence was heavier than any words. Now, sitting across from him, she realized how strange fate was. Two worlds meant to destroy each other, now sat together beneath the same stars. Her heart beat fast, not from fear this time, but from something she couldn't name. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable, and she looked away, afraid of what she might see in it. The fire crackled low, and the desert wind carried the scent of rain far away. He stood scanning the distance as if listening to the earth itself. Then he said, "Tomorrow we reach the river. You'll go north." She blinked, confused. "You're letting me go?" He nodded once. "You don't belong in my land." His tone was final, but not unkind. She felt a sting of something sharp inside. Relief, yes, but also something else she didn't want to name. He turned away, his figure merging with the darkness, the firelight glinting on the edge of his knife. She watched him for a long time, her throat tight. The man who could have taken her life now offered her freedom. And yet as the night stretched on, she wondered if she truly wanted to leave. Something about him, the silence, the sorrow, the way he looked at the stars like they carried names of the dead, pulled at her heart. When she finally lay down to rest, the ground felt softer than before, as if the desert itself had changed. Sleep came slowly, filled with half-dreams of rivers and mountains, of voices calling in the wind. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the Apache watched the horizon, his hand resting on his blade, his thoughts far from the woman sleeping by his fire. He had made his choice, but he knew the desert wasn't done with them yet, because sometimes the land itself decides who stays and who goes. And when dawn came, painted in gold and red, nothing between them would be the same. The morning came quietly, stretching its golden fingers across the dry horizon. The desert that had looked cruel the night before now shimmered with light, calm but deceptive. She opened her eyes to the warmth of the fire's last embers and the sound of distant wind. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw him standing near the edge of the rocks, looking east. His figure was still, almost carved from the land itself. She sat up slowly, brushing the dust from her dress, unsure if she should speak. He turned his head slightly, just enough to know she was awake, then looked away again. There was something about his silence that carried more weight than any words could. As the sun climbed higher, they began to walk again. He didn't tell her where they were going, only that they would reach water before nightfall. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but distant, as though it belonged to another world. She followed behind him, every step heavy with questions she didn't dare to ask. Who was he before the world turned to war? What did he see in her that made him spare her life? The more she tried to understand, the less she knew. The land around them began to change. The flat sand gave way to dry grass and scattered mesquite trees. A vulture circled far above, its shadow moving across the ground like a slow omen. The air smelled of heat and dust, and the sky seemed endless. She felt her strength returning, but the silence between them remained unbroken. Every time she looked at him, she saw something she couldn't name, a quiet sadness, maybe, or the kind of strength that came from losing everything. By midday, they rested beneath a jagged rock. He handed her a small pouch of water, and she drank carefully, every drop precious. When she tried to offer it back, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said softly. His accent was thick, the words shaped by another tongue. She studied him for a long moment. The marks on his arms, the faint scars across his chest, told a story she didn't know. Finally, she found the courage to ask, "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her then, eyes narrowing slightly, as though he wasn't sure of the answer himself. "Because you are alive," he said simply, "and that is enough." Then he turned away, leaving her with more questions than before. As they continued, she thought back to the night of her escape. The sound of rifles, the screams, the smoke curling against the sky. She remembered running through the darkness, her heart pounding, her mind fixed only on survival. The outpost had been a place of promises safety, food, shelter, but she had seen what lay beneath those lies. Men who spoke of peace while carrying hate in their hands. She had seen what they did to the Apache prisoners, how they laughed as they burned their camps. Now, walking beside one of those very men she was taught to fear, she felt the world turning upside down. Maybe everything she thought she knew had been wrong. They reached the river by sunset. It wasn't wide, but it ran clear and cold, winding through reeds that whispered with the wind. The Apache knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink, his reflection broken by the ripples. She followed, kneeling across from him. The cool water soothed her dry throat and washed the dust from her skin. When she looked up, she found his gaze on her again. This time, he didn't look away. "You said you would give me strong children," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She remembered the words she had spoken in fear, the desperate attempt to live. "I didn't mean," she began, but he lifted a hand, stopping her. "I know," he said. "You spoke to survive. But words have power, even when we don't believe them." She stared at him, unsure how to answer. There was no threat in his tone, only truth. He seemed to carry a belief that every word, every choice, had its own spirit. She wondered how many promises he had made that the world forced him to break. The river shimmered between them, catching the last of the sun's light. He stood, his silhouette framed against the orange sky. "We rest here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow you go your way." That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of water against the stones was steady, almost soothing, but her thoughts wouldn't quiet. She watched him from across the fire. He sat alone, sharpening his blade slowly, his eyes fixed on the flame. The firelight reflected the depth of his expression, neither anger nor peace, just a kind of resignation. After a long silence, she spoke. "Do you ever think about leaving this land?" He didn't look up. "The land doesn't leave us," he said. "It remembers who we are, even when we forget." His words settled over her like dust, simple yet heavy. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. They sat like that for hours, two strangers bound by silence and fate. When dawn came, the air felt colder. He woke her before sunrise and pointed north. "That way," he said. "Follow the river. It will take you to the town." She hesitated, looking at him. "And you?" He fastened the strap of his knife. "I have my own path." She wanted to say something to thank him, to ask him not to leave, but the words caught in her throat. So she only nodded, her heart heavy with something she didn't understand. She turned and began to walk, her footsteps soft on the damp ground. But after only a few steps, she stopped. A strange sound carried through the still air, a horse, then another, and then voices. Men's voices. He heard them too. His body stiffened, eyes narrowing toward the trees. "Get down," he whispered. She crouched behind a boulder as he moved ahead silently, his hand on the handle of his knife. The voices grew louder of laughter, the jingle of metal, the thud of boots. She recognized the sound before she saw them. Soldiers. The same kind that had hunted him, that had hunted her. Her pulse raced. He turned back to her, his expression sharp, focused. "Stay here," he said. The soldiers appeared from the brush. 5 of them, their uniforms dusty, rifles slung across their backs. The man in front carried himself with arrogance, like someone who thought he owned the land beneath his boots. When his gaze fell on the Apache, he sneered. "Well, look what we have here," he said, resting his hand on his revolver. "One of the red devils." The others laughed. The Apache didn't move. His eyes flicked once toward the boulder where she hid, then back to the men. His voice came low, steady. "Leave this place." The soldier grinned. "Or what? You'll curse us." He stepped forward, spitting into the dirt. "You should have stayed dead with the rest of your kind." The moment stretched thin. Then, without warning, the soldier raised his gun. The Apache moved before the shot could echo. His knife flashed once, clean and silent. The man dropped to his knees, shock on his face before he fell. The others froze for a second too long. The air exploded with chaos, gunfire, shouts, the thud of running feet. She pressed her hands to her mouth, heart pounding, as the desert came alive with violence. When it ended, the only sound left was the river, running steady as before. The Apache stood over the fallen men, his chest rising and falling, his knife dark with blood. He turned toward her then, his face unreadable. She stepped out slowly, her hands trembling. "You saved me," she whispered. He wiped the blade clean on his sleeve. "No," he said quietly. "I saved what's left of peace." His voice was tired, almost broken. He looked toward the horizon where the smoke of gunfire still hung. "They'll come again," he said. "More will follow." She shook her head. "Then come with me. Can't stay here." For a moment he almost smiled, a sad fleeting curve of his lips. "This land is all I have," he said. They buried the soldiers by the river before nightfall. She watched him work, silent and efficient, saying nothing. When it was done, he stood for a long time, staring at the mounds of earth. The sunset turned the sky to gold again, just like the first day she met him. The wind blew gently, carrying the faint scent of sage. She looked at him, her heart heavy. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "What I must." That night they sat again by the fire, the world quiet except for the murmur of the river. She wanted to ask him everything about his tribe, his losses, his scars, but she could tell some stories weren't meant to be spoken. He glanced at her once, his eyes softening in the firelight. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be harder." She nodded, though she knew she wouldn't rest. Something was changing between them, something unspoken but strong. The same man who once looked at her as an enemy now guarded her life like it was part of his own. And deep inside, she knew that whatever path lay ahead, it would test both of them in ways neither could yet imagine. The night stretched long and heavy, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The fire burned low, and she watched the Apache's face flicker in its glow, marked by shadows that looked older than the land around them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was too much between them now, too many questions, too many things left unsaid. The bodies by the river were gone beneath the earth, but their presence lingered in the air, like ghosts whispering in the wind. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had done, about the way he had moved when danger came. He hadn't killed out of anger. He had done it to protect, as if violence had become a part of breathing. And yet, when he stood over the fallen men, there had been something in his eyes that looked like sorrow. When the fire finally died, he rose and turned toward the darkness beyond the camp. "Sleep," he said quietly. "We'll keep watch." She wanted to argue, to tell him that he needed rest too, but the tone of his voice left no room for that. So she lay down, the sound of the river soft in her ears, and stared at the stars until her eyes grew heavy. Somewhere deep in the night she woke to the sound of horses. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but then she saw him silhouetted against the faint moonlight, crouched low, watching the horizon. His knife gleamed faintly in his hand. She rose without a word, her heart beating fast. "They're coming," he said under his breath. "More soldiers." Panic filled her chest. But before she could speak, he turned to her. "We leave now." They moved quickly, packing what little they had. The Apache led her through the dry grass, moving like a shadow, each step careful, silent. The sound of hooves grew louder behind them, echoing through the still air. The river vanished from sight as they climbed the low ridge that opened into another stretch of desert. He stopped only once to look back, his eyes narrowing. She followed his gaze and saw the faint glow of torches. Whoever they were close. They walked until dawn, not speaking, not resting. When the sun rose again, painting the world in pale gold, her legs ached and her throat burned. Finally, he stopped beneath a large rock outcrop. "We rest here," he said, lowering the small satchel from his shoulder. She sank to the ground, breathing hard. "How long do you think they'll follow?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Till they find what they're looking for," he said finally. She frowned. "And what's that?" He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Me." It was the first time he had spoken about himself, and the weight of that word settled heavily between them. She realized then that he wasn't just a man wandering the desert, he was being hunted. "Why?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon where the heat shimmered like glass. "Because I am the last of my clan," he said, "and they fear what they destroyed might rise again." His voice was steady, but she could hear the ache beneath it. He wasn't running just for himself, he was running from the end of his people. She sat in silence, unsure how to respond. He seemed untouched by exhaustion, yet there was a heaviness in his movements, like someone carrying more than his own weight. She wanted to ask more, but before she could, he said, "You shouldn't have stayed." His eyes met hers, calm but sharp. "You had a chance to go north. You should have taken it." She shook her head slowly. "And leave you to die out here?" He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You don't owe me anything." She stared at him. "Maybe not. But I can't walk away from someone who saved me." He didn't respond, only turned away, scanning the land again. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then, in a quieter tone, he said, "You remind me of someone." She looked up. "Who?" He hesitated before answering. "My sister. She was like you, stubborn, brave, always speaking before thinking." His lips curved faintly, but his eyes grew distant. "She died when the soldiers came, tried to protect the children." His voice grew softer, almost lost to the wind. "They didn't spare anyone." Her heart tightened. She wanted to reach out, to tell him she was sorry, but the words felt small. Instead, she said, "Then maybe saving me wasn't about mercy." He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze. "Maybe it was about redemption." He didn't answer, but something flickered in his expression, a brief moment of truth that vanished as quickly as it came. The hours passed in uneasy quiet. The heat grew fierce, and they took turns watching the distance for movement. As the day wore on, a dark cloud began to rise on the horizon. At first, she thought it was smoke, but then she saw the way it swirled and danced. "A storm," he said, his tone grave. "We have to find cover." The wind started to pick up, carrying with it the dry, stinging taste of sand. By the time they reached a narrow canyon, the sky had turned brown and red, the sun swallowed by the storm. They found shelter in a shallow cave cut into the rock. The wind howled outside, and sand poured in waves across the entrance. The storm raged for hours, shaking the ground beneath them. She huddled close to the wall, covering her face. The Apache sat beside her, unmoving, his head bowed slightly. "Does it ever end?" she whispered through the noise. "Everything ends," he said, "but not always when we expect it." When the storm finally passed, the world was quiet again. The ground outside was changed, smooth and unfamiliar. The air smelled of dust and lightning. They stepped out slowly, blinking against the weak light. Everything seemed wiped clean, as if the desert had hidden their tracks. "We're safe for now," he said. She nodded, though she could feel something shifting inside her. Safe wasn't the same as free. They continued traveling for 2 more days, keeping close to the ridges where the wind erased their footprints. The silence between them became something different. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. At night, she watched him carve small shapes into pieces of wood he carried. "What are those?" she asked one evening. "Spirits," he said. "For those who have no graves." He held one out to her. It was a small carving of a bird with wings spread wide. "This one is for your fear," he said. She looked at it, unsure. "My fear?" He nodded. "You've carried it too long." She kept the carving close, though she didn't tell him how much it meant. As they walked, she began to notice the way he listened to the wind, to the sound of birds, to the silence itself. It was as if he could read the land, as if it spoke a language only he understood. And she began to feel it too, that rhythm of survival that bound everything together. Yet beneath it all, the tension still pulsed the soldiers, the past, the shadow of something neither could name. On the 3rd night, as they rested near a cluster of boulders, a faint light appeared in the distance. At first, she thought it was a campfire. But when she looked closer, she saw movement, several figures moving slowly toward them. He saw it too. "They've found us," he said quietly. Her heart jumped. "What do we do?" His hand went to his knife, but he hesitated. "We don't fight unless we must." The figures drew closer, and she could make out their shapesmen, but not soldiers. Their clothes were rough, their movements wary. "Traitors," he murmured, "or thieves." He stood, stepping into the open. The men froze when they saw him. One of them, tall and broad, raised his hand. "We're not looking for trouble," he called. "We're just passing through." The Apache didn't move. "Oh, then keep passing," he said. The man's eyes flicked to her, then back to him. "You traveling with her?" His tone held something sharp. She felt the shift immediately, the kind of danger that came not from bullets, but from greed. The moment tightened. The wind stilled. Then the man grinned. "You should share your luck, warrior." He took a step forward. The Apache's knife flashed in warning, and the air thickened with tension. "Go," he said. The men exchanged looks, uncertain. Finally, the tall one spat into the sand and turned away. "You're lucky we're not in need tonight," he muttered. They disappeared into the dark. When it was over, she looked at him, her voice trembling. "You think they'll come back?" He nodded. "Men like that always do." He turned back toward the fire, his expression distant. "Oh, the world doesn't change. It only hides its teeth until you stop watching." She shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth in his words. The world around them was wide and empty, yet danger always found a way. That night, as the wind whispered through the rocks, she lay awake again, thinking of everything they had seen. The storm, the soldiers, the strangers, it all felt like pieces of a story that hadn't yet found its end. She looked at the Apache's silhouette against the fading firelight, the steady rise and fall of his breath. Something inside her stirred a feeling that was not just fear anymore. It was connection, fragile and uncertain, but real. And though she didn't know it yet, the true storm was still ahead, the one that would test not their strength, but their hearts. The next morning, the desert was quiet again, but the stillness felt wrong. The air was heavier, the light sharper, as if the land itself knew something was coming. The Apache stood at the edge of their small camp, eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't slept much, and neither had she. Every sound in the night had felt too close, too deliberate. The men who had passed by were not the kind to disappear easily. She could see it in his face, he felt it too. They packed quickly, moving before the sun could climb too high. The wind had died, leaving the air thick with dust and the faint smell of smoke from far away. She followed behind him, her heart uneasy. He moved silently, scanning the ridges and shadows. There was something in his stride, now tighter, more cautious. "You think they're near?" she asked softly. He didn't look back. "They're watching," he said. "Waiting for us to stop moving." His tone carried no fear, only certainty. It made her stomach twist. By midday, they reached a canyon split by jagged rocks. It offered cover, but also traps. He hesitated before entering, his gaze sweeping the cliffs above. "If we're careful, we can cross by night," he said. "If not, they'll corner us here." She nodded, though her throat felt dry.
Ow.
The path wound between red walls of stone, echoing with their footsteps. Every small sound bounced back at them, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. Once she thought she heard a whisper of movement behind them, but when she turned, there was nothing, only the shifting light and the sound of her own heartbeat. As night fell, they found a small hollow in the canyon wall and built a faint fire from dry brush. The flames barely flickered, just enough to push back the dark. She sat across from him, clutching her knees, watching his expression. "You've been quiet," she said finally. He glanced at her, then back at the fire. Quiet is safer. His eyes were distant, fixed on the flames. When men stop talking, the earth listens. She didn't know what he meant, but she didn't press him. The silence between them was heavy, filled with thoughts neither dared to speak. After a while, he pulled something from his pouch, a small piece of hide folded neatly. He unwrapped it to reveal an old locket, the metal dulled by time. She watched as he held it carefully, as if it were something fragile. "This was hers," he said softly. "My sister." He opened it. Inside was a faint drawing of a young woman, smiling faintly, the edges faded. "She said the land would remember her," he murmured. "I didn't believe it then." His voice was steady, but the pain beneath it was raw. She felt her chest tighten. "You carry her with you," she said quietly. "Maybe that's how the land remembers." He looked up at her, and for a brief moment, the cold mask he always wore slipped. There was gratitude there, and something else, something human and breaking. Before she could say more, a sound split the night. A rock shifted above them, then another. His hand went to his knife instantly. "Get down," he whispered. The fire flickered, then went out as he smothered it with his hand. Oh! The canyon filled with silence again, but it was the kind that warned of danger, not peace. She could barely breathe. A shadow moved along the ridge above them, then another. He motioned for her to stay low. A gunshot cracked the night, echoing through the canyon. The rock beside her exploded, spraying dust and stone. She gasped, pressing herself against the wall. The Apache was already moving, his body low and silent. Another shot rang out, then a third. He darted between the shadows, disappearing from sight. She wanted to call out, but her voice froze in her throat. The sound of boots scuffling echoed down the narrow path. The men had returned. She crawled deeper into the hollow, clutching the carving he had given her. The small wooden bird felt warm against her palm. Then she saw him appear again, moving like smoke. Struck one of the men before the soldier even knew he was there. A brief struggle followed, a grunt, and then silence. But there were too many. She saw the flicker of torches at the far end of the canyon, their light moving closer. He returned to her, his breathing steady but eyes sharp. "There's a passage behind this wall," he said quickly. "It leads to the ridge. Go." She shook her head. "Not without you." He grabbed her arm, his voice firm. "You go now. If they catch us both, no one leaves this place." She hesitated, searching his face for something. "Anything, you'll follow," she whispered. "What?" He nodded once. "Go." She turned and began climbing the narrow passage, her hands scraping against the rough stone. Behind her, she heard the sound of more gunfire, closer now, louder. Her heart pounded as she pulled herself upward, the walls tightening around her. When she finally reached the top, the night air hit her face like ice. She turned back, looking for him. The canyon below was chaos, shadows running, shouts, flashes of light. Then she saw him surrounded, moving fast, fighting without hesitation. For a moment, he seemed unstoppable, every motion deliberate, every strike a memory of survival. But then, she saw one of the men raise a rifle from the ridge above. Without thinking, she screamed his name. The sound echoed, cutting through the noise. He looked up, eyes locking with hers for just a second, and that second was enough. The shot rang out. She saw him stagger, then drop behind a rock. The world blurred. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, instinct took over. She ran. The path ahead twisted into darkness. She stumbled through the rocks, tears and dust stinging her eyes. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, but her body kept moving. The land stretched out before her, endless and merciless. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, she collapsed near a dry riverbed. Her hands trembled as she reached for the carving again. The little bird was cracked now, one wing broken. She pressed it to her chest, her heart aching with a pain she couldn't name. The image of him falling replayed in her mind again and again, each time sharper. She wanted to believe he was still alive, that he would find her, but the silence of the desert offered no comfort. She sat there for hours, staring at the horizon, until the faint sound of hooves reached her ears again. She froze, every muscle tense. Shapes appeared in the distance riders. The glint of sunlight on metal told her they were soldiers. Her mind raced. If she ran, they'd see her. If she stayed, they'd find her. Then, faintly, from somewhere behind, a shadow moved through the haze. Her breath caught. It was him, or maybe the ghost of him. His figure limped through the heat waves, slow but steady. Relief and fear tangled inside her chest. He reached her at last, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. She rushed to him, tears burning her eyes. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shook his head weakly. "Not yet." His voice was thin but calm. He glanced toward the riders. "They're tracking us still." He reached for her hand. "We go north." She nodded, helping him to his feet. His body was heavier now, his strength fading, but he kept moving. They crossed the dry riverbed, each step slower than the last. The riders were closing in. She could hear them calling, their voices carrying through the wind. The Apache stopped suddenly, his breath short. "There's an old mission beyond that ridge," he said. "If we reach it, we can hide." She looked ahead, just a faint outline in the shimmering air, barely visible. "Can you make it?" she asked. He smiled faintly. We'll find out. The climb was brutal. The sun beat down, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. Each step felt like a battle. She could see the old mission now stone walls half buried in sand, its roof long gone but still standing against the wind. They were almost there when the first gunshot split the air again. He pushed her forward, his voice sharp. Go! She turned to see dust rising behind them, the soldiers less than 100 yards away. They reached the crumbling archway just as another bullet struck the wall beside her. The sound was deafening. She fell to the ground, covering her head. He pulled her inside, taking cover behind a collapsed beam. His breathing was ragged now, his blood staining the sand. She looked at him, terrified. They'll kill us both, she whispered. He looked back, his eyes calm but burning with something fierce. Not if I can stop them. She shook her head, grabbing his arm. Don't do this. His gaze softened. You gave me a reason to live, he said. Now I have one to fight. He touched the carving still clutched in her hand. Keep it. Before she could speak, he was gaunt, stepping out into the sunlight, into the open. The soldiers shouted, the wind roared, and the world seemed to hold still again. She pressed herself against the cold stone, her heart hammering, listening to the chaos unfolding outside. The sound of gunfire filled the air, echoing through the ruined mission. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the heat shimmered like fire. She could hear his voice once, sharp and defiant, then silence. Only the desert wind remained. She closed her eyes, trembling, the small wooden bird pressed tight against her heart. Somewhere beyond those walls, fate waited to decide whether mercy or vengeance would win. And as the echoes faded, she realized this was the moment everything would change one way or another. The sound of gunfire slowly faded, swallowed by the wind that swept across the empty land. The echo clung to the stones of the old mission like a memory that refused to die. She pressed her back against the wall, her hands trembling as she held the little wooden bird close to her chest. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm that came before it. It was the kind of silence that made time stop. Dust floated in the air, turning the sunlight into a pale golden haze. She wanted to move, to call out for him, but fear pinned her to the ground. Every heartbeat sounded too loud, every breath too fragile. When she finally found the courage to step outside, the air smelled of gunpowder and dust. The ground was marked with footprints, broken shells, and dark stains that made her stomach twist. Her eyes searched the ruins, desperate for movement. Then she saw him lying near the steps of the mission's doorway, half covered in dust. The soldiers were gone. The wind had taken them, just as it always did with men who thought they could own the desert. She ran to him, falling to her knees beside his still form. His eyes were open, faintly glazed, staring at the sky. For a moment, she thought she was too late. Then his chest rose weakly, a shallow breath escaping his lips. You're alive, she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes turned to her, and a faint smile crossed his face. The land. It still remembers me, he murmured, his voice thin but calm. She pressed her hands against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but he shook his head slowly. It's no use. Tears blurred her vision. You can't die here, she said. Not after everything. He looked at her, his eyes deep and steady. This is where it ends. Not in chains. Not running. But here, with peace around me. She shook her head, unwilling to accept it. You're not alone, she whispered. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling. I know. He reached up, his fingers brushing her wrist. Listen, he said softly. Do you hear it? She paused, confused. Then she realized the wind had changed. It wasn't harsh anymore. It carried a low, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Look toward the horizon where the sun had begun to sink. When the wind moves like that, he said, my people believed it was the spirits returning home. She swallowed hard, unable to speak. His breathing slowed, his hand growing cold against hers. You carry the stories now, he whispered. Tell them we were here. Tell them we lived. She wanted to promise him, but her voice wouldn't come. She only nodded, tears falling silently onto the dust between them. His eyes drifted closed, his final breath, soft as the wind that passed through the ruined walls. The world stilled around her. The sky turned red and she stayed beside him until the stars began to appear. The desert was quiet again, as if the land was mourning in its own way. She gathered stones and placed them gently over him, one by one, building a small mound that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was something real, something lasting. When she finished, she laid the wooden bird on top of the stones. "You said it was for my fear," she whispered. "Maybe it's for yours now, too." She sat there for a long time, her body tired, but her mind awake. The wind brushed her hair, carrying the smell of sage and dust. In that moment, she understood what he had tried to teach her. The desert wasn't just emptiness, it was memory. Every grain of sand held the breath of those who had walked it before. Every wind carried whispers of stories long forgotten. He had been right, the land remembered. When dawn came, she rose and looked toward the north. The light touched the horizon, soft and golden, casting long shadows over the mission. She took one last look at the mound of stones and began to walk. The path ahead was endless, but she no longer felt lost. Every step felt guided by something larger than herself, something born of courage, pain, and hope. As she moved farther away, she thought of his words again, "Tell them we lived." She didn't know who they were anymore, the soldiers, the settlers, the world that never stopped taking, but she knew she would tell his story. Not as a tale of war or vengeance, but of two souls who met in the ruins of everything and found something almost sacred between them. The journey north was long. The river had dried in places, and the sun burned fierce, but she kept going. Sometimes she thought she saw him walking beside her, his shadow flickering at the edge of her vision, silent and strong as before. When the nights grew cold, she whispered his name into the darkness and felt the wind answer in return. Weeks passed before she reached the edge of a small town. Its wooden buildings looked worn but alive. The people there watched her with quiet curiosity, a woman alone, covered in dust, carrying nothing but a leather pouch and an old story carved into her heart. She didn't speak of where she came from or what she had seen, not at first. But the children would ask her about the carvings she made, little wooden birds with broken wings and open eyes. She told them about a man who once lived by the code of the land, who believed the wind carried memories. She spoke of courage, of forgiveness, of how even in the harshest places, kindness could still take root. Her words spread quietly, carried from one home to another. Some called it a legend, others just a tale to pass the time. But for her, it was a promise kept. Years went by. The town grew, the desert changed, but she never forgot the sound of his voice or the look in his eyes when the sun set that final night. She would walk beyond the edges of the settlement sometimes, standing where the wind ran free, feeling it brush against her face. And every time it did, she felt that same rhythm, the pulse of the land, steady and alive. On one such evening, an old trader passing through stopped beside her. He looked out over the horizon and said, "Strange place for a woman to be alone." She smiled faintly. "No one is alone here," she said. He followed her gaze and nodded slowly, not understanding but sensing the truth in her words. As the sun dipped behind the dunes, she took out a new carving from her pouch, a small bird with its wings whole again. She placed it on a rock and watched as the wind began to lift the sand around it. "You're free now," she whispered. The wind carried the words away, and she let it. The years softened her memories, but they never erased them. Sometimes, when the nights were too quiet, she would still see his face in her dreams, strong, calm, and full of that same unspoken grace. And in those dreams, the land always looked different, greener somehow, as if the desert itself had forgiven. The story of the Apache warrior and the woman who crossed his path became part of the desert's legend. Travelers would tell it under starlit skies, their voices hushed, as if afraid to disturb the spirits that roamed the sands. Some said he still walked there, a guardian of the wind. Others said she joined him in the afterlife, where no war or pain could reach them. But those who truly listened to the desert knew the truth. It wasn't about ghosts or miracles. It was about what it means to survive, to forgive, and to love in a world that takes more than it gives. It was about remembering, even when everything else is gone. One last time, she stood at the edge of the land where it all began, her hair silver now, her steps slow. The mound of stones was still there, weathered but standing, just as she had built it. She smiled faintly and knelt beside it. "I kept my promise," she whispered. The wind rose gently, curling around her like an embrace. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the heartbeat of the land beneath her palms. When the wind finally quieted, the desert was at peace again. The stones remained, the carving still resting at the top, its wings spread wide. The story was complete, not written on paper, but carried in the wind, in the silence, and in every breath of the land that remembered them both.